The city of Boston, January 15, 1919. The morning had been ordinary, cold, bright, and busy, the kind of winter day when breath turned to smoke and street vendors warmed their hands over metal barrels. On Commercial Street, a young boy named Dominic Ferraro balanced a loaf of bread under his arm as he ran an errand for his mother. Horses clopped past, steam curling from their nostrils, and somewhere down by the harbor, a ship's horn moaned across the bay. It was a city alive with noise and purpose, unaware that it stood on the edge of ruin. But beneath the hum of the streets, something older and more ominous was stirring, a low, metallic groan that few heard and none heeded. It came from a towering steel tank, 50 feet high and filled to its swollen rim with nearly 2.5 million gallons of molasses. For months, it had whispered its warnings in the language of stress and pressure, the slow, sticky drip along its seams, the creaking of its ribs on cold nights. But in a city ruled by profit and haste, whispers were as disposable as lives without money. It stood there like a giant holding its breath, its iron skin thin as deceit, its rivets trembling under the weight of corporate greed. The men who built it had no engineering license, no patience, and no conscience, only a deadline and a signature. When leaks began to show, they did not mend them, they painted them brown, believing that color could conceal corruption. And so, while the tank leaked in daylight and moaned in darkness, the city continued to live, never realizing that it was living beside a loaded gun. At noon, the whisper became a scream. Iron split like bone, bolts the size of fists tore free and spun through the air like bullets, and then came the wave, a black, glistening wall of molasses, taller than a man's fear, roaring down the narrow streets faster than any living thing could run. Dominic dropped the bread. The air turned sweet, and then it turned deadly. The syrup rose and carried carriages like driftwood, crushed homes like paper, and buried men and horses alike in a thick, suffocating grave. When the roaring stopped, the north end was unrecognizable, a silence filled with the sound of mourning. 21 souls lay dead, their bodies pulled from a sweetness that refused to let them go. The smell of sugar lingered over the ruins for days, heavy and cloying, like incense at a funeral that would not end. But even as the streets were scraped clean and the bodies counted, another flood began to rise, one not of syrup, but of lies. Executives in polished shoes, from offices far from the wreckage, blamed anarchists and immigrants. Politicians nodded, newspapers softened the truth, and soon the disaster was spoken of as an accident, a strange tragedy no one could have foreseen. But the truth was written in the iron that cracked, in the hands that built it without care, in the voices that warned and were ignored. The Great Molasses Flood was not a freak of nature, it was the deliberate offspring of negligence, greed, and silence. And perhaps that is why America rarely tells this story, because it is not only about how molasses killed 21 people, but about how the pursuit of profit can rot even the sweetest things, and how denial can bury the truth deeper than any grave. So the real question was never what happened, but why it happened, why men with power and titles twisted facts to protect their names, why a city so proud chose to stay quiet, why the newspapers, once fearless, learned to look away, and why, for more than a century, the truth was left to sink beneath the sugar. Why did the government protect the company instead of its people? Why did justice come crawling, years late and half-hearted? And why, even now, does the air of Boston still carry the faint, sweet scent of denial? In the story that follows, we will pull at every hidden thread, from the boardrooms where lies were born, to the courtrooms where truth was forced to crawl its way into daylight. Because here, on History Re-Echoed, we don't chase legends, we exhume them, we follow the silence, we name the men who built it, and we listen until history itself begins to answer back. Stay with me, the deeper we go, the darker it gets. America, 1919, a nation in greed and fear. America in 1919 was a country trembling between two worlds, one that had survived a war and another that no longer knew what peace meant. Factories that had once forged weapons for Europe now turned their furnaces toward wealth. The same smoke that had hidden the dead overseas now rose above American cities as a symbol of triumph. But beneath the banners and the brass bands, there was exhaustion in the soil and suspicion in the air. The Great War had ended, but the hunger that it birthed had not. Men who had profited from death sought new ways to profit from peace. Prices soared, wages fell, and corporations, swollen by war contracts, began to see the nation not as a home but as a harvest. In Washington, lobbyists whispered to lawmakers. In boardrooms, men with soft hands and hard hearts drew lines on maps and called them opportunities. And hovering like a shadow over all of it was prohibition, the promise to cleanse the nation's soul by banning the bottle, to purify men by law and force. But purity, like profit, was an illusion easily sold. The very companies that praised temperance in public were stockpiling the ingredients of vice in private, racing to turn barrels of molasses into alcohol before the ban came crashing down. One of those companies was the United States Industrial Alcohol Company, or USIA, a giant with roots deep in wartime supply and profits steeped in secrecy. Through its subsidiary, the Purity Distilling Company, USIA built storage tanks along the harbor, claiming them as monuments of industry. But what they truly built were vessels of pressure, not just physical, but moral, the kind that crushes truth beneath the weight of greed. In their haste to meet demand, USIA commissioned a tank to rise in Boston's North End, a neighborhood of immigrants who spoke more Italian than English and lived closer to survival than to comfort. It was here, among the poor, that they chose to test the limits of steel. The man in charge was Arthur Gell, a company treasurer with no engineering license, no structural training, and no sense of fear. His orders were simple: build fast, build cheap, and keep the molasses flowing. And so, in the winter of 1915, they raised a tank not forged by caution but by confidence, thin steel plates held together by imperfect rivets, seams that sang when filled, and walls that bowed beneath their burden. When the tank began to leak, Gell ignored it. When it groaned, he painted it. And when neighbors complained that the air smelled like sugar and rust, the company told them it was safe. In a world ruled by deadlines, danger was merely another cost of doing business. By 1919, the nation stood on a fault line of change. The Red Scare had turned suspicion into policy, immigrants were labeled as anarchists, and justice belonged to those who could afford its language. The tank on Commercial Street was not just a storage vessel, it was the perfect metaphor for America itself, immense, unregulated, and full of pressure no one wished to acknowledge. So when it burst, it was not only steel that failed, it was a system, a conscience, a promise that progress and morality could coexist. And though the flood drowned the streets of Boston, the negligence that created it flowed far beyond the city's borders, seeping quietly into the foundation of a nation still learning how to measure the worth of human life against the weight of profit. The tank of death. It stood there on Commercial Street, vast, cylindrical, and silent, a colossus of steel and arrogance rising 50 feet above the cobblestones. To the families of Boston's North End, it was as ordinary as the lampposts that lined the streets, yet as impossible to ignore as a mountain that hummed. They called it the molasses tank, but it might as well have been a monument to negligence, its shadow stretching across the tenements where children played and men labored in the thin light of winter mornings. The tank was supposed to hold the sweetness of the Caribbean, thick, dark molasses brought from Cuba and Puerto Rico, destined to become industrial alcohol for a nation thirsty for war and money. But what it truly held was pressure, invisible, mounting, and ignored. The steel that contained it was thin, barely 3/8 of an inch, riveted by untested hands and blessed only by a treasurer's confidence. No engineer had signed the plans, no inspector had marked it safe, and no one had ever tested it properly. It was built in haste, filled in greed, and left to stand in silence, trembling under the weight of its own deceit. From the day it was filled, the signs were there. Neighbors spoke of the groaning sound that echoed through the night, a sound that seemed to come from the earth itself, as though the tank were a living thing in pain. On warmer days, dark syrup seeped from its seams and stained the ground below, leaving trails that drew children from nearby streets. They would bring cups and pails to collect the sweet drips, laughing as the molasses stuck to their fingers. The laughter carried through the air, mingling with the sound of horses and the distant toll of ship bells, and for a while, it almost seemed harmless, a strange, sticky wonder in a hard city. But not everyone laughed. Dockworkers muttered that the tank wasn't right, that the steel flexed too easily, that the air around it felt tense. Some said they could feel the vibration when trains passed. Others swore that on cold nights, it moaned like something alive. Complaints reached the offices of the United States Industrial Alcohol Company, but the answer came back with the same indifference that builds empires and buries men: paint it darker, so the leaks won't show. And so they did. A new coat of brown paint spread across the tank's surface, thick and glossy, like an attempt to bury guilt beneath color. The leaks were hidden, the sound dismissed, and the city returned to its rhythm. Children still played, dockhands still worked, and the tank still trembled. It stood like a confession no one wanted to read, an altar built not for worship, but for sacrifice. Inside, the molasses was alive. The warmer syrup from the south mixed with the cold northern air, creating pressure that rose and swirled with every change in temperature. The steel plate stretched, the rivets strained. Each groan was a warning, each drip a prophecy. But warnings are useless to those who believe themselves untouchable, and prophecy means nothing to men who measure worth in profit. And so it stood, waiting. Waiting for the perfect hour, when the sun would climb just high enough to warm its skin, when the gases within would expand, and when the false strength of human pride would meet the immovable law of physics, waiting, as the city went about its business, believing itself safe. The tank on Commercial Street was not just a structure. It was an omen, forged from steel and denial, a monument to a nation's impatience, and a tomb waiting to be filled. The weight of sweetness. To understand the flood, you have to understand what filled the tank. Molasses, thick, dark, and slow, the syrup left behind when sugarcane is refined. Sweet to the tongue, heavy to the touch, and worth its weight in gold. It was the blood of an empire built on sugar, harvested under the Caribbean sun, boiled until it darkened like oil, then shipped north in barrels that smelled of rum and salt. To the laborers who carried it, it was exhaustion. To the merchants who sold it, it was fortune. And to the United States Industrial Alcohol Company, it was something even greater, a liquid inheritance of power. Because molasses was more than sweetness, it was raw material for transformation. Through the slow fire of fermentation, it became industrial alcohol, the same alcohol used in ammunition, cleaning solvents, and wartime fuel. During the Great War, it had been a quiet weapon, and when the war ended, those who profited from it refused to stop. But there was another shadow on the horizon: prohibition. The government's plan to ban alcohol loomed over the nation like a moral storm. For the distillers and chemical giants, time was running out. They rushed to stockpile what they could, filling every barrel, every tank, every corner of steel that could hold a profit. The tank on Commercial Street was born from that desperation, 50 feet tall, 90 feet wide, a steel vault of greed masquerading as progress. It was filled not with care, but with haste. No engineer had signed off on its construction. No inspector had tested its strength. It was built on orders from a treasurer who answered only to the clock. Each shipment of molasses arrived warm from the tropics and was poured into the cold winter tank, the metal sweating and straining under the sudden change. The syrup inside churned and fumed, building invisible pressure against its thin shell. And still, the company kept filling it. More ships came. More heat. More weight. More risk. It wasn't just a tank of syrup. It was a reservoir of consequences, a monument to a kind of progress that valued speed over safety, profit over people. And when the time came, it would not merely break, it would erupt, carrying with it the proof that greed, once pressurized, always explodes. The day the molasses came. The day began like any other, with the rhythm of hooves on cobblestones, the hiss of steam from factory vents, and the thin sunlight crawling across the harbor. The north end of Boston stirred slowly, its narrow streets alive with the smell of salt and wood smoke. Housewives scrubbed their stoops, children chased one another between wagons, and dockworkers gathered at the freight yard for the noon shift. There was nothing in the air to suggest that history, in all its cruel inventiveness, was holding its breath. At exactly 12:30, the sound came, a deep, metallic groan that rose from the earth and split the air in two. For a heartbeat, it was almost beautiful, like the low note of a distant organ vibrating through the bones of the city. And then, without warning, beauty turned to terror. Iron tore like parchment. Steel split like flesh. Rivets the size of fists shot outward in every direction, slicing through the air with the force of gunfire. The ground convulsed, and then, in an instant too quick for prayer, a wall of darkness erupted from the ruptured tank, bursting into the sunlight like the birth of something monstrous. It was molasses, 2 million gallons of it, thick, black, and alive with fury. It moved faster than belief, 40 miles an hour, some said, a wave 25 feet high, glittering with shards of light as it devoured everything in its path. It swallowed carts and horses, splintered fences, and crushed houses. It tore the Engine 31 firehouse from its foundation, carrying the men inside like leaves in a storm. Firefighter George Leigh, buried in the rising tide, fought to free himself before the syrup closed over his head like a curtain. The sound was unlike any other, not the crash of water, not the roar of fire, but something slower and heavier, a suffocating thunder that filled every space and left no room for breath. The molasses poured into doorways and cellars, swept people from their feet, and pinned them against walls. It filled mouths and lungs, silencing screams before they could form. A 10-year-old boy, Pasquale Ian Tosca, was seen running toward his home before the wave caught him. A mother, Maria Di Stasio, searching for her daughter, vanished beneath the swirl of brown. Horses reared, eyes wild, their cries muffled as they sank. In seconds, life became movement, desperate, sticky, unrecognizable. Within minutes, the north end was a sea of syrup. Wooden beams floated like driftwood. Cries for help came muffled through the thick sweetness that covered the streets. The smell of sugar filled the air, intoxicating, nauseating, mixing with the scent of salt and blood. And above it all, the tank that once stood proud was gone, a twisted skeleton of steel, steaming in the cold January light. When the wave finally stopped, silence fell, heavy and absolute. What had been a neighborhood was now a graveyard, a landscape glazed in brown, where the dead and the living were trapped together in the same glistening stillness. Rescue workers came, wading knee-deep in syrup, their boots pulling against the sticky ground. Some said they could still hear the faint groan of the tank's remains, as if it were mourning the lives it had claimed. By nightfall, the city's lights flickered across the flooded streets, reflecting off the molasses like oil. The cries had faded, replaced by the slow rhythm of shovels and the whisper of prayers. The harbor itself turned dark that week, its waters stained with sweetness that refused to fade. And as dawn rose the next morning, Boston stood in disbelief, the sweetness still in the air, the silence too heavy to bear, and the truth already beginning to hide. Because even as bodies were being pulled from the syrup, and families mourned what they could not recover, the story was already being rewritten, shaped by hands that feared blame more than they grieved the dead. What happened next wasn't just tragedy, it was betrayal. And that history re-echoed, that's what we expose, the cover-ups, the quiet lies, the histories rewritten by power. So if stories like this matter to you, if you believe truth should never drown, make sure you're part of this journey. Subscribe, and help the echoes reach farther. The cover-up. When the flood subsided, Boston's north end looked like the aftermath of a war. The streets were silent except for the slow squelch of boots and the distant cry of gulls circling above the wreckage. Firefighters and sailors waded through the syrup that clung to everything, walls, windows, faces, searching for the missing. Some carried shovels, others carried bodies. And as they worked, the city watched in stunned disbelief, trying to make sense of a disaster too strange to seem real. But in the offices of the United States Industrial Alcohol Company, disbelief quickly turned to strategy. Before the dead were counted, before the syrup had cooled, the company's lawyers had already decided on a story. The tank, they said, had been sabotaged. It wasn't negligence, they insisted, but terrorism, an act of destruction by Italian anarchists angry at American industry. The claim spread like smoke. It was convenient, patriotic, and above all, useful. The year was 1919, the height of the Red Scare. Fear of immigrants, radicals, and revolutionaries filled the newspapers, and suspicion was the cheapest currency of power. To blame anarchists was to speak the language America already understood. And so the company spoke it fluently. They told reporters that the explosion was deliberate, that foreign hands had planted a bomb inside the tank. Newspapers echoed the lie, printing it beside images of mangled steel and flooded streets. The headlines called it a terror attack, and the public, hungry for order in a world of chaos, accepted it. The victims were mourned, but not defended. Their deaths became part of a narrative that served the powerful and silenced the powerless. Meanwhile, the truth waited, quiet, patient, and heavy as the syrup that still coated the city. Because those who dug through the wreckage knew what they had seen. They knew the tank had leaked for months. They knew the steel was too thin, the rivets too weak. They remembered the sound, the groan, the warning that no one had wanted to hear. The flood was not born of malice, but of greed. Not of hatred, but of hubris. Yet in a time when immigrants could be accused for simply existing, the word of the poor meant little against the word of a corporation. The survivors, Italian laborers, dockhands, widows, found themselves on trial in the court of public opinion. Their pain was doubted. Their voices were buried under official statements printed in clean ink and careful grammar. City officials hesitated. The mayor's office delayed investigations. And the state, eager to protect industry from scandal, allowed months to pass before any real inquiry began. Evidence was mishandled. Witnesses were intimidated. The tank's blueprints were conveniently misplaced. The same men who had ignored warnings now wrote reports insisting there had been none. When the victims' families filed lawsuits, they were mocked, as if seeking justice were an act of defiance. The lawyers for the company arrived in court dressed like priests, speaking of patriotism and sabotage, while the widows sat in the back rows in black shawls, their hands folded around photographs. The hearing stretched on for years, and each day the truth had to fight its way through layers of polished deceit. But truth, like molasses, moves slowly, and once it starts, it sticks to everything. By the time the court-appointed investigator, Colonel Hugh W. Ogden, finished his inquiry, the evidence was undeniable. The steel was too thin. The rivets were brittle. The design had never been reviewed by an engineer. And the men who built it had chosen speed over safety, money over morality. The verdict was clear: the United States Industrial Alcohol Company was to blame. But even in victory, justice felt hollow. The company paid a settlement, $628,000, less than the cost of the molasses they lost. No one went to prison. No one resigned. No public apology was made. The executives who had painted over leaks and silenced the truth returned quietly to their lives, their names scrubbed clean by time and distance. And Boston, exhausted and ashamed, buried the story beneath its streets. The city rebuilt, repaved, repainted, and the memory of the flood began to fade. Yet the sweetness never truly left. On hot days, locals still claimed they could smell molasses rising from the cracks in the cobblestones, as if the earth itself refused to forget what men tried to hide. Because this was never just the story of an accident. It was the story of a lie told so often it almost became history. The fight for justice. In the months that followed the flood, the syrup hardened, but the grief did not. The city scraped its streets clean, washed its walls with salt water from the harbor, and burned the smell of sugar out of the air. Yet for the families who had lost everything, nothing could be made clean. They buried their dead in small ceremonies attended by neighbors in silence, and when the coffins were lowered, the earth itself seemed reluctant to receive them, as if it too remembered how heavy sweetness could become. But grief, when left alone, can ferment into resolve. And so the widows and the laborers, the fathers and sons of Boston's North End, did what the powerful never expected them to do: they fought back. They had no money for grand lawyers or polished suits. What they had were memories, and the unshakable knowledge that the tank had cried for help long before it burst. They gathered signatures, shared testimonies, and demanded that someone, somewhere, listen. Their voices, once dismissed as noise from a foreign quarter, began to gather weight. 119 lawsuits were filed against the United States Industrial Alcohol Company, each one a small act of defiance against an empire that had already written them off as collateral damage. The cases merged into one great hearing, a legal leviathan that would stretch over 5 long years. Inside the courtroom, the air was thick with the same tension that had once filled the tank. On one side sat the company's lawyers, men with calm voices and clean fingernails, armed with paperwork and persuasion. On the other sat the families, faces lined by grief, hands rough from labor, their clothes marked by a poverty that had long ceased to embarrass them. Between them stood the question that the city itself had refused to ask: what is the price of a human life when weighed against the profit of a corporation? The hearings became a theater of endurance. Day after day, survivors took the stand, dockworkers describing how the tank groaned, mothers recalling the smell that seeped into their windows, firemen speaking of comrades buried alive. Their words painted pictures the defense could not erase, yet every truth had to crawl through a swamp of denial. The company insisted the disaster was sabotage. Their witnesses spoke of radicals, of bombs, of plots whispered in the alleys of the North End. But when the evidence came, when the fragments of the tank were studied, when the thinness of the steel was measured, when the records of ignored warnings were read aloud, the truth rose again, slow and unstoppable, like syrup warming in the sun. Presiding over it all was Colonel Hugh W. Ogden, a man of law and conscience, whose patience became the pulse of justice itself. He listened not just to the testimony, but to the silence between the words, the silence of workers who had not been believed, of children who would never speak again. His report, when it came, was not dramatic, but it was devastating. He declared that the tank had failed because it was poorly designed, improperly built, and recklessly maintained. No bomb. No saboteurs. Only greed wearing the mask of progress. The ruling made headlines, briefly. The company was ordered to pay compensation, $628,000 in total, a figure that, divided among the dead and the living, seemed almost insulting in its smallness. For every life lost, the law offered only a few $1,000s, and not one man responsible ever saw a prison cell. Yet for the families, it was never about the money. It was about being heard, about carving the truth into the record so that even if the world forgot, the paper would remember. They had fought the system and forced it to speak the word it feared most: guilty. When the hearings ended, the North End did not celebrate. There were no parades, no headlines of triumph, no speeches about justice. There was only quiet, a tired, fragile quiet, and the slow return to ordinary life. The children went back to playing in the streets, though the air still smelled faintly of sugar on hot days. The survivors went back to work, carrying with them the knowledge that justice, like molasses, moves slow, and that sometimes victory is nothing more than the truth refusing to sink. The forgotten legacy. Time, like molasses, moves slowly, and it covers everything. In the years after the flood, the streets of Boston's North End were rebuilt, the wreckage cleared, the stains scrubbed from the brick and stone. New children were born who never smelled the sugar that once drowned their neighborhood, and new voices filled the alleys where screams had once echoed. Life, as it always does, returned, quietly, insistently, pretending not to remember. The United States Industrial Alcohol Company paid its debt and vanished behind new names and cleaner ledgers. The tank was never rebuilt. The site where it stood became a plain patch of land beside the elevated tracks, unnoticed by most who passed. There was no monument then, no plaque, no sign that 21 lives had been lost to greed thinly disguised as progress. For decades, it remained that way, a place scrubbed of guilt by time and denial. Yet memory has its own stubborn chemistry. On summer days, when the air grew heavy and the heat pressed down upon the harbor, old residents swore they could still smell molasses rising from the cobblestones, faint, sweet, and impossible to mistake. They said it was the city remembering what men had tried to make it forget. Historians would later call the Great Molasses Flood a curiosity, a strange footnote in America's industrial past, something to be marveled at, not mourned. But to those who lived it, it was a revelation of how fragile safety can be when built on arrogance, and how quickly human lives can be measured in gallons and dollars. And yet, from that tragedy, something lasting did emerge, a reckoning. The disaster became a mirror that forced Massachusetts, and eventually the nation, to confront the quiet danger of unregulated ambition. No longer would great structures rise without the approval of licensed engineers. No longer would corporations be trusted to police themselves in the name of progress. The molasses tank, in its destruction, gave birth to modern building codes, to accountability written into law, to the faint idea that human life should not be a negotiable expense. But laws can be forgotten as easily as lives. And the same hunger that filled that tank, the rush for profit, the blindness of haste, still moves through the veins of nations, disguised in new forms, hidden behind polished glass and digital screens. When pipelines burst, when factories collapse, when rivers run poison and skies burn red, the same refrain echoes through the chambers of power: it was no one's fault. It was unforeseen. The flood in Boston was not unforeseen. It was forewarned, whispered by metal, testified by workers, ignored by men in suits. And so it remains, not as an oddity of history, but as a warning written in sugar and steel. If you stand on Commercial Street today, near where the tank once rose, you'll find a small plaque, easy to miss, simple in its words. Children pass it without reading, tourists barely notice. Yet beneath that ground lies the memory of 21 souls, and beneath that memory lies the lesson that nations still struggle to learn. That the greatest disasters are not acts of God, but the acts of men who believe they can play his part. And on some warm days, when the wind turns in from the harbor, the city still exhales that faint, sweet scent, the ghost of molasses, as if to remind the living that truth, once spilled, can never be fully cleaned away. The sweet taste of memory. They called it the Great Molasses Flood, as if giving it a name could make it smaller, stranger, easier to digest. But it was never truly about molasses. It was about men who mistook ambition for wisdom, who painted over danger and called it progress, and who, when the cost came due, buried the truth beneath the sugar. History remembers the date, January 15, 1919, but not the warning signs, not the creaking of the steel, not the children collecting syrup from the seams. It remembers the number, 21 dead, but not the names, the faces, the sound of their voices as they were swallowed by something as simple, and as damning, as neglect. The flood was brief, but its shadow is long. It runs through every corporation that cuts corners, every government that looks away, every system that forgets the people beneath its profit. It reminds us that the deadliest things often come not from hatred, but from indifference, from the quiet decision to do nothing, to say nothing, to pretend that danger wears a different face. Today, the city stands clean. The streets are paved, the buildings new, and the world has found other tragedies to remember. Yet sometimes, on warm days, the wind still carries a faint sweetness, a scent so small and so stubborn it feels almost sacred. They say it's the molasses, seeping up through the cracks of history. But perhaps it is something else, perhaps it is memory itself, refusing to be silenced. Because history doesn't forget on its own. It has to be made to forget. And as long as someone remembers, as long as someone tells the story, the sweetness will always carry its warning. What happened in Boston was not an accident. It was a mirror, and it still reflects us all. And as long as someone remembers, as long as someone tells the story, the sweetness will always carry its warning. This is history re-echoed, where forgotten voices rise again, and truth refuses to stay buried. Subscribe, and let the past speak, before it's silenced once more.